Okay, picture this. It's 63 years before the Common Era, and the entire fate of Judea is just hanging by a thread. You've got this one Judean king, Aristobulus, squaring off against the full might of Rome. His very next move is going to bring the legions of Pompey the Great right to the walls of Jerusalem. What happens next, which we know thanks to the historian Josephus, is this incredibly tense story of pride, fear, and a catastrophic miscalculation that would literally seal the fate of a kingdom. So let's dive into exactly how it all went down. So, after wrapping things up in Syria for the Roman Republic, the famous general Pompey turns his attention south, right towards the simmering civil war in Judea. And, he wasn't there to just watch from the sidelines. No, he was there to impose Roman order. And his first item on the agenda? Dealing with this defiant Judean king. Aristobulus, he sees this storm coming, right? He doesn't just wait around in Jerusalem. Instead, he pulls back to this mountain stronghold called Alexandrium. Now, Josephus tells us this place was a fortress of magnificent strength, perched way up on a high mountain. It was seemingly untouchable. You gotta think, from up there, Aristobulus probably felt pretty secure, like he could negotiate from a real position of power. But Pompey didn't see a king in a fortress. He just saw a problem that needed solving. And his response, which Josephus records for us, is just dripping with pure Roman authority. No negotiation, no if you please, just a simple, blunt command, come down. I mean, that one sentence tells you everything you need to know about the power dynamic here. So this command just throws Aristobulus into total chaos. His royal pride is basically at war with the terrifying reality of Roman military power. And this is right where the king's fatal indecision really starts to set in. And it's not just fear, it's also the different political groups all pulling him in opposite directions. The king was completely trapped, and not just by Pompey, but by his own advisors. You had the pragmatists in his ear, begging him, telling him that Roman power was just irresistible. They were arguing that a direct fight would be a suicide mission. And this wasn't just about facing an army. It was about facing the fact that the world's only superpower was now on his doorstep, and a lot of his own people knew that resisting was just hopeless. Now, what's really fascinating here is how you can almost see his fractured state of mind. He would actually come down from his fortress to meet with Pompey, trying to plead his case, save his throne. But then, feeling like he'd humiliated himself and his royal authority, he'd go right back up the mountain, down to plead, up to preserve his pride. This happened over and over again. And this just perfectly sums up the king's psychological state. Josephus absolutely nails it with this line. Aristobulus was desperately clinging to the hope that he could somehow talk his way out of this whole mess. But he was also paralyzed by the fear of submitting to a foreign power. It's like he's walking a tightrope, and the winds are seriously picking up. Look, Pompey was a general, not a therapist. This constant back and forth completely wore out his patience. He decided to just force the issue. No more talks. He delivered an ultimatum. Hand over all your fortresses now. And under all that pressure, Aristobulus finally caves. Look at the steps here. He's forced to personally write letters, and they had to be in his own handwriting because that was the only way his governors would obey, ordering them to surrender his kingdom's defenses to Rome. He does it, but Josephus makes it really clear. He does it with this deep, simmering indignation, a rage that's just about to boil over. And this is it. This is the moment. This is where everything changes. That humiliation of signing away his kingdom's defenses with his own two hands, it's just too much for Aristobulus to take. The time for waffling back and forth is over. That humiliation was the final straw. He storms away from Pompey, calls off all negotiations, and races back to his capital, Jerusalem, with only one thing on his mind: war. For Aristobulus, diplomacy now just felt like disgrace. Defiance, no matter how crazy it seemed, was the only path he had left for his pride. I mean, did Aristobulus seriously think Pompey was just going to sit around and wait for him to get ready? Not a chance. The Roman general moved immediately. He marched his army straight for Jerusalem, hot on the king's heels. There was no time to rally the troops, no time to shore up the walls. The consequences were already on their way. Now, there are a couple of key things happening on this march that just dial up the tension. First, Pompey gets news that his great enemy Mithridates is dead. This totally frees him up, making his campaign here even more urgent. And second, check out the route. He passes through Jericho. Josephus describes it as the most fruitful land in all of Judea, full of palm trees and this precious balsam. So just imagine the contrast, the grim, grinding machinery of the Roman army marching through this rich, beautiful landscape, all on its way to lay siege to the holy city. Well, as soon as the dust from those Roman columns appears on the horizon, the reality of what's coming just hits Aristobulus like a ton of bricks. His nerve completely breaks. Forgetting all about his defiant pride, he rushes out of the city to meet Pompey, not as a warrior, but as a beggar. He promises Pompey absolutely everything. You can see the terms right here, a huge pile of money and the complete surrender of Jerusalem. And for a second, it actually looks like it might work. Pompey agrees. But then, the final fatal mistake. When Pompey sends his men to the city gates to collect the money, Aristobulus' own war party, the very same people who pushed him towards defiance, refused to let the Romans in. They slammed the gates shut, defying not just Rome, but their own king. For Pompey, this was the absolute last straw, the ultimate insult. The promise was broken. He'd been made to look like a fool. And his anger was immediate and total. He arrested Aristobulus on the spot, putting the king himself in chains. The siege of Jerusalem was now a sure thing. And that really brings us to our final question, doesn't it? We've just walked through how this toxic mix of royal pride, paralyzing fear, and one finally broken promise completely shattered Judean autonomy. Those gates of Jerusalem were closed that day not just on a Roman messenger, but on an entire era of independence. It was a single series of events that kicked off decades of Roman domination, all stemming from this one man's catastrophic indecision.